Please welcome to the stage Holly Ransom and Steve Williams, President and CEO of Suncor Energy.
Brilliant. Well, good afternoon, Disruptors. I hope you enjoyed your lunch and took full opportunity to get to know people that are here in the room and to explore the Collision Hub area and get involved in as many of those activations as possible. My great privilege to be here with Steve Williams. Steve, thank you for joining us.
Good to be here.
A huge conversation that you and I are going to have, and I'm going to open it up as well and just let everyone know we will be taking questions from the floor for Steve, so you can submit them using the hashtag EDU2018, and we'll turn to questions a little bit later in the time we've got together. Steve, I wanted to talk to you though, this whole concept, the whole reason this conference came about is this whole idea of Energy Disruptors Unite. Yeah.
Time out. I was told two things when I came here. One is it's the graveyard shift, so it's going to be really difficult to get people back from lunch, so try and put some energy in it. The second one is, in case you can't tell from out there, you're going to be sat on the most uncomfortable armchair in the world, and it's really true. So have some sympathy for us. Sorry.
You're all good. Well, given that, the theme of the conference is Energy Disruptors Unite. What does that whole idea or that concept mean to you?
When I think of energy disruption, I like to just take a step back and put it in some context. And for me, the disruption is, energy is just a symptom of it. So I look back and I look at the world we live in, 7 billion people on its way to 9 billion people. 700 million people coming out of poverty into consuming classes in the last 10 years. And those things are great successes. The consequence of that is people want more food. They want more medicine. They want to be able to get to and from their work, so they want a mobility solution. And the consequence of that is the world needs more energy. And so how we manage that energy, given the world is changing so fast, is I think what the conversation is about. And one of the phrases I push back on is sort of a transition, as though it almost sounds as though we know where we're going to and where we're coming from. We know a bit about where we're coming from, but we definitely don't know where we're going to. And so an awful lot of what you'll hear people say, I think, is about pushing off and starting to get stuff done. We have to start to make progress because 7 billion people are having a big impact on the world, and it's not all positive. There is climate change happening. We have to start to address it. So we have to start to make progress in this energy journey that we're on.
I think you touched on a really interesting point, though, and one that comes up a lot when you have this conversation, the uncertainty of what lies ahead. How, as a CEO, as a chairperson, do you prepare for that strategically? How do you deal with setting a horizon that you're not really sure will come to fruition or on what time frame?
Yeah, and I would say, I'll answer that and I'll talk to what that feels like from a CEO's point of view, and particularly from a CEO of a global oil corporation. But it's much the same for everybody, I suspect. You can apply it to different degrees, you can apply it in a different context, but it's about getting stuff done. And I speak with a funny accent, not quite the same funny accent as you, but one of the great things about Calgary in Canada is it gets stuff done. And the biggest problem in a conversation is often, so what's that context? Well, for me, I get stuff done, I'm applying vast amounts of capital, finance and people. So I have to take a 50-year type horizon. So I'm looking at long-term opportunities, long-term solutions. I'm looking at places in the world where I can have confidence that spending that money can come to sensible fruition. And that makes energy really challenging. It makes Canada really challenging because there are lots of conversations. There are lots of forces. Some are pulling and some are pushing. And so my horizon is 50 years. We've just literally in the last few months been bringing on an investment, a very big investment, a $17 billion investment we made in Alberta here. And that project will operate for 52 years. So in order for me to satisfy my stakeholders and shareholders, I have to give them a vision of what the world will look like in 50 years. I have to work with the communities so that they're better through the whole of that process. I have to work with the other businesses in a way where they'll be there in partnership with us. And in 50 years, the world completely changes. And that's why I view it as sort of this journey, or this rapid innovation, this revolution in the way, the company that I run now is nothing like it was 50 years ago.
And so talk to me, how much of, I guess, creating that future or bringing it to life is what you're doing at Suncor in your own business, and how much of it is actually thinking about the sector at large, the country at large, some of the community initiatives you talked about? How do they kind of play together?
Yeah, it's all of those and more. So it's all of our stakeholders, whether that be the communities, the employees, the shareholders, all of those. It's the technologies which are evolving rapidly, which we to an extent have a control over. But to me, it's as much as anything, it's a frame of mind, because we can't control everything. There are some things where we are the absolute instigators of innovation and technology. I could talk to some of those later. There are some where we're just takers of it. There are some where we're part of something that's bigger. So, we can't solve the world's energy challenges from within an oil and gas company. We start to grow bigger than an oil and gas company, so we start to move into wind power, solar power, potentially tidal power, nuclear power, and we look at the whole issue. But some of those things we're able to set the boundaries on, some not. So, the comment I make to most people is you have to go at it with an open mind. You're trying to gain a picture of the world. You need enough confidence to take the first step, but you can't fix it. And you have to keep that mind open as it evolves.
You mentioned solar power, tidal, a variety of new arenas that Suncor have gotten into over the recent period of time. I guess the title of this session is a low-cost, low-carbon future for the oil sands.
Yep.
Talk to me about how you think about Suncor's role and I guess the spread or the involvement that you might have across a variety of different energy forms.
Yeah, I'll use those two examples, if you like, because there's where we've seen the first parts of the revolution. So when I joined this industry in Canada, I've been in the energy industry for 40 years. I know I don't look old enough, but for 40 for 40 years. And I came into Canada 16 years ago. And then one of our big businesses in Canada is the oil sands. It was viewed to be highly environmentally invasive and very high cost. Today, it's now one of the low-cost setters in the industry, and I could talk about how we've achieved that later. And we're now every day we get better in terms of our carbon footprint. The plant I just talked about has a carbon footprint from how we take it out of the ground to being consumed by a customer, which is lower than the average barrel on this continent now.
Wow.
So we've been able to take the technology on. Some of that we've done ourselves. Some of it we use the leverage of external resource as well. But it's changing out of recognition. That's going to happen again. It's going to happen again in the next 10 years and in the 10 years after that. So, I'm very optimistic about the future of the energy industry, and I think oil and gas will forever will be a part of that. But it requires this rapid evolution.
Talk to us about that journey from high cost to low cost. How did you navigate that, and what was the imperative behind it? What forced the change? Was that the changing economic landscape, consumer landscape, suppliers, you name it?
Our main product just goes into a commodity market, so we can't fix the price of our main product, which is fairly difficult for an industry. So we have to look at how we can control the costs to, in our case, largely manufacture the product, because most of the oil and gas industry, it drills a hole, pressure pushes it up, and then it gets taken to customers. For us, ours is much harder work. We have to extract it, then we turn it into a liquid or a gas form so it can be transported, and then it gets consumed. So we had a lot more to work on. So that journey in the last 10 years has taken us from a cost of just around $40 a barrel down to today just above 20, and I can see it getting down into the teens. That's been a journey of scale, of better technology, of getting clever at what you do, having to be far smarter. And that's why the future is so optimistic. You know, if I look at the applications of digital technologies or artificial intelligence or machine learning, the ability to adopt that in a capital-intensive, data-intensive industry like ours is vast. What it means is you can take some things right to the leading edge. So the first fully autonomous heavy vehicle fleet in North America is operating in the Canadian oil sands. And it's just amazing to watch. Now, what that means is the trucks operate all of the time. They only stop to be fueled. They don't break down so often. We used to have a paradigm where our trucks were best driven by females, because females are better drivers than men are of those large vehicles, because men tend to drive them.
Cheers in the audience. Heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen.
Do you need a job? We need help. Because they drive them more sympathetically than men do.
Sympathetically, there you go.
But actually, the bad news is the completely autonomous ones are even better. Yeah. So they drive almost perfectly. They accelerate perfectly, they brake perfectly, they don't bump into things. The biggest problem we have with them is they're so these things are the size of a jumbo jet. They're so accurate, wow. They carve a hole in the road, so we have to move them over a few millimeters every time, so that they actually flatten the road rather than digging a hole in the road. But the first application of that is in the Canadian oil sands. So, you know, the ability to adapt and take these technologies is what's going to be the key.
Brilliant. Now, one of the things we touched on this morning is how charged the energy conversation is. I don't know that it ever hasn't been, but certainly at the moment it's a very emotive and often quite polarised conversation. I'm interested for how you navigate that. How do you approach getting into conversations that often have people at completely opposite ends of the spectrum butting heads, really?
Yeah. I mean, more broadly, first, I would step back and say, welcome to the world we live in now. You know, if you talk to politicians, they'll talk about wedge issues. And what they really mean is, how do we drive a wedge between this group and this group? Or NGOs who will take, you know, an item and make it so extreme that normal people can't talk about it. Or companies which might do the same. I'm not attributing it to any particular group.
Yep.
But what we've found is that doesn't actually make any progress. That journey I started, how do we supply energy to 9 billion people? How do we provide energy at a cost which enables more people to get food, to get medicine? That requires real fixes and real solutions and real pragmatism. And that's a much more difficult world to work in. We think we're at the bleeding edge of that world. So we work very hard with other industry partners. We work very hard with NGOs, and we decided. I'll give you one example. We tried to break that paradigm particularly in the oil sands and oil and gas world. So we sat down with the leaders of the world's NGOs, and it took us a couple of years to have the debates. And what we found was we were starting at very different positions, but our values were very similar. You know, it turns out we all actually care about the community we live in. We all want a better place for our children and our grandchildren. Oh, my son's here, Jack's here somewhere, so you know, I had to give him a call out. We have to create a better world for you know, our children and our grandchildren. So we found some areas where we could start to get closer together. And then when we started to really look at the issue, and this, as I say, this is one particular example, we found that it turns out politicians are quite extreme. It's very difficult for them to occupy what I call that common sense piece in the middle. So he said, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll work with the NGOs and we'll try and get, as far as you can, a science-based, reason-based solution. And we did. And then we said, okay, well, it's great, but it's in a vacuum. We need it to be enacted into public policy and into law for it to become effective. And partly because of the fortune of governments changing in Alberta and then in Canada nationally, we were able to get that adopted very quickly. That's become the basis of the leading best edge practice on the planet now for climate change and carbon regulation. And that became, so, you know, 3 or 4 companies, half a dozen NGOs, putting together some policy, getting politicians to take it on. But I'll tell you, it was a brutally tough process. It took us 2 years. We had to do it, you know, we had to be hidden from sight. We were doing it on weekends. We were doing it nights in dark rooms. We had to eat a lot of the unreasonable things that we all brought into the room. We had to get past that. But now, 3 or 4 years later, I go into world climate change discussions. Canada is viewed to be the leader in the world now. It has a national carbon pricing regime. It has, the oil sands is the first reservoir in the world to have a CO2 cap put on its development. And all of that was developed by cooperation. So it's brutally tough. It takes really courageous and brave people to do it, but it can work.
So when you think about the future of the energy sector in Canada, what gives you greatest cause for optimism? And what do you think is the biggest challenge on the journey there?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I wouldn't say it's a slam dunk. It's tough. It's a tough conversation. It's a tough debate. I am incredibly optimistic around it. If I look, I see, first of all, I see, you know, great innovation and creativity in the right places where it really matters. We've got the leading edge in the world, best innovation organizations in Alberta, in Canada. And they're developing, you know, the one of them, COSEA, which is around environmental development, has put a billion of capital in there from the companies. We've had 1,000 pieces of intellectual property developed, and it's pushing the boundaries of science back, and it's a model for the world about how to do that. We're starting to really solve some of these big issues. CO2 is probably the toughest and will take us the longest, but if I look at, and you never satisfy everybody, we would have had 3 or 4 real big challenges we were looking at the beginning. One would have been water consumption. Second one would have been land disturbance. And you know, CO2 is a big one in there, and tailings. And 3 of those 4 are on their way to being solved. We now use a fraction of the water we used. So we use less than a third of the water we used, and we produce 3 times as much oil and gas. So much improved. Tailings, lots of conversations about how it's going to be done. We believe we are in the throes of developing the technology to solve that issue, not just for Canada, but for the whole of the mining world. Land disturbance, we've now completely reclaimed the first of the tailings ponds, and it's trafficable, and it's now a nature reserve. So CO2 is the tough one. It's a planetary challenge because it's not a local issue. The climate doesn't care whether it comes from Canada or it comes from China. It has a warming effect around the Earth. We're starting to make real progress there. But I can see tons of things we can do right now. Some of them are outside, some of the vehicles that are here. You know, if you really want to get to it fast, this is a great step, but there are bigger steps we can take around fuel quality, around engine efficiency, that we could be implementing right now. You know, we've known how to have much more efficient engines than we've got on this continent for the last 30 years, and they haven't been used. We know how to do that, and we should be taking those steps.
So what's the roadblock in the middle of the path to doing that?
Actually, that polarization debate. You know, what's happening is people are trying to take extreme action. If I think of, you know, I've been involved in the climate change conversation since the 70s, and it's made very poor progress by any measure. We can talk about, the conferences, we can talk about Paris, but actually look at the CO2 emitted in the world, and we haven't made much progress. The way our energy consumption in Suncor, we use 50% less energy per barrel that we take out now than we did 10 years ago. Our next plan is to use 30% less by 2030, and we think we've got the technology already to do it. So those bits of technology require development and then real action to take. And we've got to start moving into that solution space. So the biggest barrier is this polarized, confrontational approach, which doesn't take us forward.
Now, questions are flooding in via Twitter, so I'm going to start moving to some of the Twitter feed. Keep the questions coming if you've got them there. Question from Jim. Can Canadian oil and gas move from being price takers to price makers?
No. No is the simple answer. We produce a commodity. The total size of the Canadian industry is about, depending on what you're measuring and how you include gas, 4 million barrels a day of a market which is 100 million barrels a day. So you can't set price from there. So our challenge is to be competitive on price and competitive on carbon. We are now, and it's complicated. My life is complicated. But the way economics have been done have not represented the industry. So we presented it in a different way. We are now one of the lowest cost operators. So, that plant I talked about, for the next 50 years, I can produce a barrel of oil for $20 a barrel. And that's 20 Canadian dollars a barrel. The rest of the world will struggle to compete with that because it has to look at its full investment cycle as well as its operation. Our resources are vast and long-term. So we won't be price setters. We can be the low-cost setter. And my honest belief is that we will be one of the last barrels of oil produced by choice from the world.
Great. Keep the questions coming. I'm going to jump back to one of mine for the moment. What role do you see technology playing in the industry? You've touched on how significant it's been to this point. Where do you see the next frontier of innovation and development really having an impact on the cost game and right the way through the spectrum?
We are a heavy technology, capital-intensive, data on huge scales industry. It's going to have a massive impact on us. The biggest impact will be artificial intelligence and machine learning. We're just putting together, and we're having to drag ourselves up the learning curve because although we do all of those things, we've still got a ton to learn about it. So the whole of the top team of Suncor are on a, we're teaching ourselves about artificial intelligence. The whole team have just been down to Seattle with Microsoft and Boeing to look at some of their stuff. I spent a week down in Silicon Valley last year looking at what Facebook and Google can teach us. And I think you never get there. It's just a realization that there's so much more you can do now. The ability of us to use the data we already had to much more beneficial results is becoming clear. So I think that's where we'll see the biggest breakthrough. The challenge is, of course, what's the consequence of that? It's definitely a big business. The societal question is, what does it mean to us all if we don't need so many people to do the jobs?
Yeah, absolutely. The automation role in businesses. Do you, because people sit on two sides of that coin, right? You've got the pessimists who think the jobs are disappearing. You've got the optimists who are saying, yes, but they'll be created in the disruption. How do you think about it when you look at your business?
I think both of those are true.
Yep.
So I have no doubt that automating a truck means I don't need a driver. So we don't need a driver, but I do need other skills. And if I look at the net result, some people talk about this as the fourth industrial revolution. If I look at the first three, the net result has been more jobs. So I think the two will be in tension. I suspect there is a crossover coming in the next 50 to 100 years where we'll be so efficient we won't need everybody to work the way we've been used to working.
Now, question coming in from Carla. Someone has to ask it. What about pipelines?
What are you thinking? What's the issue with pipelines?
Yeah, it's not a hot button topic at all, right?
What's pipelines?
What do you think?
Again, I'll start small, Suncor, and then I'll build the picture up. So, You know, I've been worried about pipelines for a long while, so we've managed the company not to be impacted by these current pipeline debates. So all of our products go to market by pipeline. We're just putting the major expansion is almost up to its full level of operation now, and we have enough pipelines for the whole of that piece. So for me, pipelines are about you know, the mid-20s and beyond. That's not the case for the industry. The industry needs pipelines right now, and it makes absolutely no sense not to build a pipeline. It's the most environmentally friendly way of getting our product to market. It's the safest way. It's the least likely to have an impact. It's never complete. Nothing is completely zero impact. If I look at the overall objectives of, and it's one of the nonsense pieces around the environmental debate. I'll jump aside and tell you a story. I was in at a conference in January this year, and sat next to me was the architect of the Chinese economy as we know it today. And he was talking about their energy strategy and some of the problems and challenges that they have. And his biggest issue was trying to get a secure oil and gas energy supply. And he couldn't get one, and he said, Canada is part of that problem because I can't be sure that you're going to have an LNG plant to get the resource to me, and I can't be sure you're going to get your oil to me, so I have to do things to manage that. And he said, we are now going to start increasing the number of coal-fired power stations we're building again. So we've got Tesla, everybody's seen here, fantastically innovative vehicles they're building. You've got China talking about significant electrification over there, and they're going to generate the electricity with coal. It makes absolutely no environmental sense to do that. And yet you try and have that debate with a narrow environmentalist, and they don't want to build a pipeline. You actually take the world forward by building that pipeline and reducing the coal that's being fired in those power stations. But it's very difficult to get people to talk on a big enough scale who have control of the issues. So an awful lot of the debates we've been taking have taken us backwards. That's why you know, we've not seen much progress on global CO2 emissions 40 years into the debate, because people have to start to do some things. So it's a real challenge in terms of how you get that balance between the longer-term vision and doing the right things and the short-term goals that people have.
If I can ask a follow-up, you've mentioned the challenge of the conversation, the polarization already. How much harder is that made by the modern media environment in terms of how fragmented it is, the omni-channel nature of it, the echo chambers? How difficult is it to keep your stakeholders informed and to educate people?
I mean, I think you've nailed it. You know, we've not met before today. I think you've just put your finger on what the issue is. Communication is so effective and happens so quickly that if you have a noisy minority, they drown out everybody else. And it's becoming there are bigger questions than just energy disruption. I think democracy itself is at threat. You know, does it work in a world where a few people can have such a massive input? And it was Churchill who had an expression that all it takes for evil to prevail is for a few good people to stay silent. And so if we go away with something, we've got to stop being silent. We can't let, whether it's a political extreme, an industrial extreme, whether it's a company doing it or a CEO doing it or an NGO doing it, we can't let people use these communication mechanisms to huge effect, but they're not representing us anymore. So I think it is a threat, and I'm not sure what the answer is.
Yeah. We've got a question coming through from McLaren Edge. Steve, what are your views on companies like Suncor getting closer to your customers by moving into the world of energy and transition from pure play oil and gas company to a broader energy company?
I think it's a great idea. I mean, our guiding vision statement in the company is creating energy for a better world. We are heavily based on oil and gas, and that's our main business today. We were the first at large scale into solar power in Canada, and we bought and sold some of those businesses, but we're still very large in wind farms, in solar power, in electricity generation. We're one of the biggest generators in Alberta. So I see our business as the whole of that energy industry.
Awesome. A question from Kabir. Question for Steve. Can you comment on the outlook of the petrochemicals industry in Canada? What other streams are there for diversification?
Yeah, I mean, there is a fair amount. So we're one of the largest refiners in Canada too. There are some simple rules of thumb around the oil industry and gas industries in particular. And one of them is that you normally take crude oil, or in Alberta's case, a synthetic crude oil, out of the ground, and you move that to your customer, and then where the product is consumed, it gets made into products. So if you think of crude oil, it has anywhere between 20 and 50 products in there. We make it into, we make the light stuff into the gas we use to cook. We'll make, then we'll have it going through, gasoline, diesel fuel, jet fuels, heating oils, bunker fuel oils, feedstock for plastics, feedstocks for the clothes we wear, all the derivatives you can think of for oil and gas. Typically, what you do is you take the crude. You've got one vessel, one pipeline taking it, and then you refine it, and then you distribute it to the customers at the point. So Canada's not a big population country. So we have, relative to our biggest market, the US, we're 10% of the population. So conventional wisdom would be you normally would move that more to the market. I think we'll see some derivatives developed. I think you'll see a little bit more refining. But there hasn't been a refinery of any scale built on this continent for a generation. And that market is peaking. So it's very difficult to see how you can justify spending tens of billions of dollars on a refinery or chemicals plant in a market where you can't distribute it, because then you'd be putting it into vehicles, putting it onto planes, putting it onto trains to move it hundreds, if not thousands of miles. So it's not immediately obvious that you should be building big refineries of chemicals when you look at the economics of it. It's understandable why governments like it and populations like it, because it creates jobs, it creates value add in the region. But you have to be very cautious. The economics overall don't work very well.
Question on why hasn't LNG been adopted for mine haulers in the oil sands? What is the biggest challenge for this adoption?
It is possible. I mean, actually, I joke, and the scientists will probably get it sooner than others. I mean, our trucks are electric, so but we just happen to have a big diesel generator on board. So what we do is we put diesel into it, it generates electricity, and then the vehicles are so big it distributes the power to each of the wheels, and there's an electric motor, so it does it by electricity, and there's an electric motor on each of the wheels which then drives it. So it's sort of a hybrid vehicle. So we use our hydrocarbons, and we take that we make that diesel on site. So we take we do the initial refining on our site, make that diesel, and that's the most effective way of doing it. We could do that with LNG as well. Now, LNG plants themselves are quite complex and quite big. So whether you would ever use LNG in that particular service, but the principle is a good one. But we have an abundance of gas. Gas is some of the cheapest gas in the world is in British Columbia and Alberta here, because we can't get it to market. So at times we're almost giving it away.
I wanted to ask you, following up on our conversation earlier talking about automation, one of the things that struck me when you were talking about going and learning from Boeing and Google and these Microsoft and companies like that is the lateral learning and the application of industries completely foreign in many ways, traditionally, to oil and gas and to the work that you're doing, all of a sudden now having real relevance. How do you see the talent profile of the people that you're hiring in the business changing? Are you hiring technologists now and people that are at the forefront of artificial intelligence and data?
Yeah. Again, I'll tell you a little story. So I was you're going to think I spend all my time at conferences. I was at a conference with Microsoft and Bill Gates last year. And we got a very similar question that came from the audience. And as you can imagine, the conference had a big component of particularly artificial intelligence in it. So, and the question was, so what would you advise the next generation to take up as a career? And Bill gave an answer that shocked the audience. The last part of it, so I'll get to I'll save it to the last. But it'll be particular fun here in Calgary. So he said, well, first of all, artificial intelligence and machine learning is going to change the world as we know it. It's happening so fast, and it doesn't have the controls of a mature industry. But you're seeing it. You're seeing it everywhere, and it will change out of recognition our lives within 10, 15 years. And we're all starting to see that happen now. You go on and you look for something on the internet, and the next thing you know, when you look, it's got you targeted, and it's got your profile, and all the stuff you didn't even know you were about to think about is starting to come up there. And all the things your children were thinking about that you didn't know about were coming up there.
Shout out to Jack once again. Hi.
Yes, just be careful, Jack. Your dad's not so stupid. The second one was precision medicine.
Okay.
The ability to take the devices that probably half the people in the room have got on them now and take trends and data and anticipate and predict illnesses that haven't happened will mean that you can head off things before they become significant. So with relatively simple measures of temperature and blood pressure, you can learn all sorts of things over time. And so those two were the theme of the conference, so that appealed. And the third one, he said, was the surprise, was energy.
Yeah.
The third area I would advise people to go into is energy. And if you haven't been lucky enough to speak to Bill, he's a very thoughtful guy. So he had the next answer ready as well. And he said the reason for energy is because the laws of physics will never change. And it sounds such an obvious thing to say, but it doesn't matter whether you generate it with oil and gas. It doesn't matter whether you generate it with nuclear power. It doesn't matter whether you generate it with wind or tidal. It takes energy to move something. It takes energy to lift something. It takes energy to bring your food to you. It takes energy to bring the medicine we need. It takes energy to get us to the hospital to have the treatment we need. And as 7 people move to 9 billion people, that's a vital part of what's going to direct, assist, help the world achieve what it needs to achieve. So he picked energy out as the third one. And with energy, what are those skills are? First of all, when I went to school, I took a degree that has lasted me my life. That's not going to happen in the future anymore. People, it's a state of mind. I mean, the good news is you get to this age, you can still learn as much in a day today as I could when I was 20. So you can retrain, you can start to do different things. But I think people will have to come into work with an open mind. I think they're going to have to probably, they'll be continuously retraining, but at minimum they'll retrain 2 or 3 times in their life. So they'll start in one thing and they'll move on to another thing. In fact, sorry, poor Jack's getting a hard time today, but both my children in their mid-20s, both of them are on their second careers already.
Yeah, wow. It's such an interesting time of transition. And the other transition I wanted to ask you about, you've picked up on the topic of corporate social responsibility and the role you've got in community. I think Larry Fink from BlackRock kickstarted quite a significant conversation with his letter to shareholders earlier this year. I wanted to know how you've seen that conversation change over the course of your career and how you see that playing out over the next 10 years with stakeholders, with shareholders, you name it.
Yeah, I mean, what Larry wrote was very easy for us to read. And I think most companies who are very active in their communities long term had already been moving in some of those directions. But it was a great reminder for the corporate world that companies and CEOs who are fortunate enough to be in the positions have to rise above just the profit. motivation. That's not what life is about. It's important because that's what gives us a lot of the value in everyone's day-to-day life, but it's not enough anymore.
Yep.
So I think if I went back 20 or 30 years ago, I'd say that if people, they would think of shareholders, and then they would think of everyone else who was around it. But there was a primacy around the shareholder. That's not the case anymore. We have to look after our employees. We have to look after the communities we work in, and that's deep. We live in the communities we're in. We live there, and we tend to be there for hundreds of years, not tens of years. So in lots of ways, we bear a bigger responsibility than governments bear, because we're not a government which is going to change every 4 or 5 years. We plan to be in Fort McMurray for the next 100 years, and we will behave in a way that will be welcomed there. So, but it's not enough just to have good wishes. You have to do real stuff. We would see ourselves towards the leading edge of that, trying really hard. I'll give it one of the most difficult issues we have in Canada is with First Nations and the relationships and how that's developed and how bad we've been over time. I'll give you an example of how we've tried to break that paradigm in Suncor, because quite often it's thought to be something you just bolt on at the end of it. Part of that $17 billion investment I talked about, we worked with our local First Nations so that they could take a share in it. And one part of it lent itself to it particularly. So we had a $1 billion tank farm there, which is where all the product goes on its way to be put into pipelines to market. We did a joint venture with them. So they raised $500 million. We put the other $500 million, and now they're 49% owners of that. That gives them a steady income of $30 to $40 million a year for the next 50 years. That's what's needed. So it's not a handout, it's a hand up. We're working together to do something in the long run. They can now go and start to, with confidence, build what they want to build as a community. So that would be the biggest ever investment by a First Nation in industrial investment. In fact, any investment by a First Nation in Canada ever. And it makes real difference. So it's about finding those real, tangible opportunities which help them achieve their objectives. It's not about meeting our objectives, it's about helping them do the things they want to do. So it becomes more important. So I think we're learning, I think industry is doing better, I think government is doing better, but we've still got tons to do.
I think it goes to the heart of a theme that's been consistent throughout your answers, which is new collaborations, new ways of thinking about how we bring different parties together to get a better outcome.
Well, it's interesting that I think it was today, I was told on the way in here, the Canadian Energy Person of the Year is a First Nation chief.
Wow.
Jim Boucher from Fort McKay.
There you go. So, yeah, round of applause. That's great. Exciting announcement. I wanted to ask you, we're nearing the end of our time together, something we've commented on, routinely over the course of today is we're blessed in so many ways to have so many leaders from so many parts of the energy value chain here in the room with us. If you could encourage them to leave this room and put into action something, what would your call to action to the room be?
It would be relatively simple. It's very easy to come to things like this. It's very easy to be on the outside looking in. That dilemma we talked about of, what does social media and speed of internet communication mean? It means that bad things can happen easier. It's really important that we stand up and do some things that are different. Pick an issue and go and make some difference on it. Get involved and concentrate in that solution space. It's not enough to be on the outside talking about somebody else doing it or not doing it. It's important for us to get in that space and do it. And I think if we do that, we can make this a much better place. And that's where, Energy for a Better World comes from, because our message to our employees is, come on, let's get involved and engaged in this and make a difference.
And if I could ask a follow-up, what would be your best bit of advice for getting to the solution space?
An open mind. The toughest thing in the world to do is to compromise. It's the easiest thing in the world to take a position and be intransigent. The most difficult thing is to enter a space and be willing to give something up.
Yeah, easier said than done. And something I can imagine you've encountered multiple times over the course of...
I've still got the scars all down my back here.
Steve, final thought. When you're watching trends and you're keeping an eye on where the future's going, what are you watching with the greatest level of excitement?
I think probably that technology question. I mean, we struggle, companies struggle because sometimes they view things as a zero-sum game. If you win, I lose. If I win, you lose. And the world is set up around intellectual property rights, and most of the entrepreneurs in here will think that they'll invent, the innovators will invent something, they'll transition that invention into some intellectual property and create something, whatever it is, and then they'll make their fortune out of that. That's the very opposite about what I'm talking about in terms of the environment and safety. What the companies did was they pulled all the intellectual property they had, they put it into a pool. They shared it, and they developed the future together. So we have to challenge some of those models we're looking at. It's important in that space to share knowledge and develop improvements, because how can you protect something intellectually around a better environment or saving someone's life? So I think we have to challenge those models we have as we drive towards that solution.
Brilliant. Well, I think a great call to action to end on there, the importance of getting involved in an issue that you care passionately about, going in with an open mind, trying to occupy that solution space. Steve, you've been an absolute delight to talk to. I think so incredibly generous in not only the time that you've given us, but your preparedness to answer everything and anything we could have thrown at you. Can you join with me, Disruptors, in thanking Steve Williams?
Thank you,
Steve.
Thanks very much.
Okay, bye.